Thank you for taking the time to watch my video. I really appreciate it. If you enjoyed this video, please click thumbs up, as that will help grow my channel. If you'd like to subscribe, I'd appreciate that as well. And if you have any questions, feel free to leave those and I will respond. Again, thank you. I've done a couple videos already that are related to this, if you've been following my channel on a regular basis. This is an elm log that I turned out into a bowl, and I turned this a year ago, so it's dry now because it's an inch thick, and the general rule of thumb is about a year per inch, and I had it in the kiln for a period of time as well. So it's dry. I'm going to turn it live edge so you can see the bark here. It looks good and solid, so I'm going to turn it, make it live edge. But I do have a problem, and I want to talk a little bit about that. This had a tenon on it, and you can see the remnants of that. It broke off. So what I'm going to have to do now, when I was rough turning it, it broke off. So what I'm going to have to do now is I'm going to have to come up with a way of mounting it in my lathe so I can turn it a second time. So I've got a couple options on how to do that. I could glue a waste block on it and mount it in my lathe that way. I'm going to do something a little bit different. I'm going to return a new tenon because I've got lots of thickness in the bottom, so I've got lots of room to turn a new tenon. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. So let's get it over to the lathe and we'll take it from there. Before I get started, if you've been following my channel all along, you may have remembered last video that I posted, I did some cutting boards and I told you that my lathe was out of commission. It turned out that my motor wasn't working, but one of the viewers that follows my channel regularly suggested that it could be a starting capacitor that was the problem. And fortunately, that's what it was. I replaced it, and $15 later, my lathe was up and running. So thank you very much for all my loyal viewers. So I had hoped to turn a new tenon on the bottom of the bowl, but you can see clearly in this picture that the inside of the bowl had a ridge on it, so it wasn't smooth. So the bowl was slipping. So I ended up hot gluing it onto a waste block. Here you can clearly see the waste block and the fact that I've hot glued it on. What I do with this is I take glue sticks and I melt them in a metal dish on the stove, and then I just dip the waste block into it and then mount that on the bottom of the bowl. So normally when I'm doing a cut on the bowl, I normally take my bowl gouge and I come up the side of the bowl. You typically want to make sure that the wood in front of your tool is supported. So by going downhill, which I'm doing here in this picture, it means that the wood in front of it is not supported. And generally that gives you a rougher surface and sometimes a catch. But with every exception, there's an exception. And in this case, it actually worked fairly well to use my bowl gouge as a scraper and to even go down the bowl as opposed to come up the side. Now I'm refining the surface a little bit more using my negative rake scraper. And eventually you see here, as I mentioned before, I'm now going uphill. So I'm going from the bottom of the bowl to the top of the bowl. It's supporting it better, and this is giving me a better, cleaner surface. when using your bowl gouge, you can do it a number of ways. You can present the tool, the front of the tool to the wood and ride the bevel, or you can turn it over on its side and use the edge of the gouge as a scraper, which you can see I'm doing here. So unfortunately, as you can see, I still have a live edge, but I no longer have any bark. I had glued it, put some CA glue right along the seam, which would have been the seam right here, the interface between the wood and the bark. Unfortunately, as I was turning, I noticed a little crack in the bark itself, and I was thinking to myself, I really should put some more glue on that. And I didn't, and just seconds later, that piece of bark came off. So it was a pretty big piece, and I couldn't find it. I did find it later, but initially I couldn't find it. So I ended up taking all of the bark off. Still has the live edge, so I just sanded that down a bit so it's not rough. And I finished it with a varnish, or sorry, a spray lacquer. And I'm going to go ahead and get ready to part this off, and then we'll be ready to engrave my logo on the bottom of the bowl. I've switched to the inside, and I didn't do any recording on the inside. I'm pretty well done. I've got a little mark right there that I'm going to try and get rid of, but it's pretty uniform thickness all the way down the side of the bowl. So it's almost ready to sand at least the inside of the bowl. Got a little bit more to do on the outside as well. The bottom is still too thick, so I got to go deeper there. But I'm pretty well done. Now, with the live edge, you do have to be careful, especially on the inside coming in, because you don't want to break that bark off. The other thing is you got to be very careful and make sure you keep your hands away. On a flat bottom, on a flat top bowl, I'm not concerned about that. Even if you do touch it, nothing's going to happen. But this has got a couple things going against it. Number one, it's a very rough surface, so that would tear you up. And also just the live edge, the shape of it. So you do have to be careful with your hands around the outside. Other people have asked me, they've seen my videos, and I'll touch a bowl when it's turning. And when it's turning fast enough that it really can't do any harm. Again, this is the exception. A live edge that's non-uniform in shape on the top and also with the rough bark. So you do want to be careful there. I'm going to do a little bit more work here, just smoothing out this side here, and then go a bit deeper, and then we'll start sanding. So there's the inside finish. That's about sorry for the light, that's about as thin as I want to go. It's under ½ inch for sure, maybe 3/8. Smooth inside, just needs a bit of sanding, but we're in good shape. I did, off camera, run a bead of glue all the way around the edge here, where the seam is, where the bark joins the bowl, because I was afraid of losing some of the bark. I did have a little piece of bark come out that I ended up gluing back in place. You'll never notice that. It was actually, I don't know if I can find it. I think it may have been right from here to there, I believe, but you'd never notice that. And I've still got to sand it, it'll blend it in even more, but I don't think you'd notice. Other than that, the bowl is ready to be sanded. There's a bit of tear out here, but I'll be able to get that with sanding. You missed a great video. I did a bunch of talking, realized the camera wasn't turned on, so I'll do it again. I have some tear out here, and you can see a little bit of it here and right in through here, and then of course 90 degrees to that. there's a little bit here. It's not as bad as it looks. There's some discoloration there as well. Tear out, I've talked about on my channel quite a bit. It's where the ends of the fibers are, and when you go across them, they tend to become a little hairy. Your best bet to remove them is a really sharp tool, and I've done that, and I've scraped it. I've used my negative rake scraper, and I'm still chasing it a little bit. I don't want to go any thinner, so I'm not going to take any more off with a scraper. But I tried my negative rake scraper, a regular scraper, as well as my carbide, and I think I've gotten it about as good as I can, and I'll just sand the rest. But off camera, the other thing I did was I applied some sanding sealer. The sanding sealer just helps stiffen those fibers up that are, again, ends of fibers like this. It'll stiffen that up, and then it'll make it easier to sand. So I've applied that, I'll let it dry, and then come back and sand it. So unfortunately, as you can see, I still have a live edge, but I no longer have any bark. I had glued it, put some CA glue right along the seam, which would have been the seam right here, the interface between the wood and the bark. Unfortunately, as I was turning, I noticed a little crack in the bark itself, and I was thinking to myself, I really should put some more glue on that, and I didn't, and just seconds later, that piece of bark came off. So it was a pretty big piece, and I couldn't find it. I did find it later, but initially I couldn't find it. So I ended up taking all of the bark off. Still has the live edge, so I just sanded that down a bit so it's not rough. And I finished it with a varnish, or sorry, a spray lacquer. And I'm going to go ahead and get ready to part this off, and then we'll be ready to engrave my logo on the bottom of the bowl. As you can remember earlier, I mentioned that I was hot gluing this onto a waste block, and you can see that very clearly here. The other thing that I do is when I go to remove the bowl, and I've already done a cut here off camera, but I take my parting tool and I start to cut straight into the bottom of the bowl, and that will make a slot and remove material from the bottom of the bowl. I go as far as I can with that. The tool, I don't like taking it all the way in because I don't want the bowl to come off the lathe in an uncontrolled fashion. I do hold on to the edge of it, but I just go in until I think that there's probably about a half an inch of material, and then I cut it off from the rest of the way. Once I've gone about as far as I can with my parting tool, the next thing I do is I make a final cut. Here you can see with a saw that's called a Japanese saw. What's different about this saw is normally a saw blade will have teeth that extend out on both sides. A saw blade is widest at the teeth. It's wider than the actual blade. This will end up scratching your material as you're cutting it. And you've all seen, I'm sure, wood that you cut with a saw, and you can see saw marks in it. With the Japanese saw, the curve of the saw is flush with the side of the saw. So if you put that side up against a finished product like the bowl, then you'll get no scratch marks. Still cut, but you'll end up with no scratch marks on your wood. So if you've watched some of my previous videos, you'll know that I got a laser engraver. And one of the main reasons I wanted to get the laser engraver was so that I could engrave my logo on the bottom of my work. So this engraver obviously is meant to engrave some relatively flat, smaller, thinner projects. But you can do a bowl. And the way I do it is I have these first block is permanently mounted to this board, which has a grid laid out on it so I can position things. Then you can just add Lego blocks, basically as legs to extend the laser bed up. So I've added an equal amount all the way around, and then I've adjusted my laser focal length to match to what I want for the engraving. So now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to engrave my logo, the date, and the species on the bottom of the bowl. Another piece of functionality that the laser has with it is it has a frame button, so I can push that as well, and it'll just outline the area that I need where the engraving is going to take place, and then I can adjust the bowl up and back, left and right, in order to center my logo. So I'm looking at that, and with the framing, that seems pretty good. I may want to move it just a little bit that way. I think I'm happy with that. So I'm going to go ahead, put my safety put my safety glasses on, and we'll go ahead and start the engraving. Here you can see the engraving underway. I've sped this up significantly just because it's more of the same. I believe this is at 16 times. The actual engraving took about 5 minutes. Although it may seem like a long time, it's something that you can start and requires no involvement. Once it begins, you can walk away and come back when it's finished. Here is the logo that I engraved on the bottom of the bowl. So you can see Bert's Bowls with a picture of the bee. I think that's very clear. The date as well. In the future, I do want to make a change to the font I've used. This says that the species was slippery elm. For me, it's not quite as readable as it should be, so I will be looking at changing the font that I use for that. Here are some examples of some other projects that I've done. Here you can see a Christmas ornament with a picture of a friend's dog, some engraving on a cutting board, and also some slate tiles that I engraved for coasters. The engraver has a wide range of materials that it can engrave on: wood, slate, glass, plexiglass, and so on. And I'll continue to do more of this along the way and share it in future videos.